So we've got a few signed up. Hopefully a big portion of those turn up today. I want to make this more of a conversation between the two of us, and then I really would like the audience to participate through questions, because this is my third ABM event this month, and I'm sure people might be a little bit bored of listening to me. So someone like yourself that's got like a to share, and hopefully we can tap into that and get the crowd involved, and then take some stuff away. So one to few ABM today, 20 accounts. I feel like this is something that you've got a wealth of experience around, and so why don't I just ask you to formally introduce yourself, give everyone a bit of a breakdown about your background and why I really wanted you to come today.
Okay, well, that's very kind, Paul. First of all, thanks for inviting me. For those of you I haven't met before, Robert Norum. I've worked in B2B marketing for 30 plus years. I normally cap it at 30 years, otherwise I sound even older than I really am. And that's been heavily in technology, but also in media and professional services and so forth. And I'm now in my 11th year in account-based marketing. I fell into it when a colleague introduced me to an agency back in 2012 who were just kicking off. And I've been working in that space ever since. So that's been working directly for clients, giving them consultancy around setting up their strategy, running their programs and delivering them, and also working with a wide cross-section of agencies internationally, sometimes to help them with their own approach to ABM, and sometimes to help their clients, when they have consulting requirements. I've also run the ABM Essentials training course, as I know you know, for B2B marketing for 6 years now, and we've had certainly over 500 people. I think with private courses, probably nearer 600 people come through that. So ABM, if you slice me in half, ABM is probably appearing somewhere like a stick of rock across my inner torso.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. And I'll second that. I've actually both been through Rob's calls and had Rob work with me as a consultant, which was a very interesting project, to say the least. I think we'll just leave it there. And that's not in no way like a negative comment about myself and Robert. It was just like the way that everything unfolded. So private joke. But guys, look, Robert, one to few. What's the official breakdown of that from your perspective?
Well, I think it all started, of course, with one-to-one. Which is look at your most important accounts and prospects and deliver some really, highly personalized programs to them. But of course, one-to-one is resource intensive, it's budget intensive, and it's really only going to fly if you've got really large opportunities. And typically I would talk to my clients about 7-figure revenue opportunities. So, but beyond that, companies have said, well, we love one-to-one, but we can't do that for all our accounts. Where do we go next? And I think one-to-few is where people go next. And I would now recommend in some cases it's actually where people start. Mm-hmm. Because what it does is it gives you most of the kind of facets, most of the strengths, most of the things that are really good about one-to-one ABM, but it enables you to do it in a slightly more scaled way. That de-risks your investment and gives you the opportunity to engage, 10, 15, maybe 20 accounts, I'd say at the top end, mm-hmm. In a very personalized way. So for me, without it sounding like just copying one-to-one and doing it in a lighter touch way, I think it's taking most of the kind of skill sets, most of the approach, if you like, of one-to-one, and applying it to probably an industry sector where you have a number of accounts that you really want to focus on. So I think it's a nice staging post. I'm sure you're going to talk about one-to-many in one of these podcasts at some point, where you're talking much more about digital marketing and much more about volume. And obviously at the top end, you've got one-to-one. So one-to-few for me is just a really nice way of creating highly personalized programs, but doing it, with an element of scale to it.
Okay. And in what sort of circumstances could you kind of build that in our mind's eye?
Well, I think, if you just take the UK financial services sector, if you were thinking about a one-to-one program, you might say we're going after Barclays Bank.
Yeah.
But if you wanted to look at it from a one-to-few perspective, in the UK or maybe even in Europe, you might say we're going to look at major banks, but we're going to identify 20 being your sort of ideal number. So let's say that's actually broader than the UK, because I don't think we'd struggle to find 20 banks in the UK. But let's say there are 20 banks in Europe. So now, rather than focusing exclusively on Barclays Bank, what we're going to do is we're going to say, let's look at these banks that we've selected across Europe. Let's look at the sector as a whole. Let's look at the business drivers, the pain points, the regulatory landscape, what's going on from a business perspective. And let's look at the big themes that those banks are looking to address. So as always with ABM, you want to kick off by engaging your internal stakeholders. Where are we? Where do we want to be? Where are the gaps in our knowledge, etc. But really, ABM comes into its own play, particularly in one-to-one and one-to research and insight. So the first thing we need to do, obviously, is to understand what is going on in the banking sector in Europe, and what are the hot buttons, what are the triggers, what are the pain points that we can help to address as a business. And that then drives your strategy for the program, and it drives your value proposition and messaging for the program. And then, of course, what you want to do, if you take my analogy of replicating the one-to-one approach, you would come up with a messaging for these 20 banks. But in the actual delivery, whether that's the white paper, the ebook, the landing page, the video, etc., you would try and personalize it as much as you can for that individual bank that you're going to land. So, the themes and the content would be the same, but what ING see versus HSBC versus Deutsche Bank versus Lloyds should all vary and be personalized to some degree.
Okay. And in terms of like execution, what could that personalization look like?
Well, I think you start off in a one-to-few context by building the master. So, if you're going to think about a go-to-market plan, I would normally say, these are not must-haves, but they're generally pretty solid. You start off by creating a really compelling sales deck for your sales team, because, of course, they're on the front line, and you want them telling the right story in the right way. So imagine you start with a master sales deck for European banks. Yep. For each of the accounts that you're going to put this deck in front of, you're going to personalize it. So maybe the front page of the deck is going to feature the HQ of Deutsche Bank, of ING, of HS. When you go into the deck, maybe you're going to pull out a few industry quotes. Well, you probably personalize that by pulling out industry quotes from people, that work at HSBC or ING or whatever it might be. So the first thing I think is the deck. What else do you want? Well, you're almost certainly going to want to run this program to European banks for an extended period of time. So I would suggest you build a microsite or a landing page that's going to, give you a place to host your content. So again, you would create the master version, which would be for European banks. And then I would suggest you find a way of personalizing that by account. So in the first, initiation, if you like, or the first example of it, you've got a master version that anybody can land regardless of their IP address. But using technology to brand names, I'll leave that for you to do. You can obviously reskin websites and microsites on the fly based around the IP address of the visitor. Yep. So that would enable you to reconfigure the site in real time for somebody coming in from Deutsche Bank, from HSBC, from any of these brands I keep mentioning. And you could, of course, take a more traditional approach, which is just to build 20 microsites, but that is time and cost intensive. So probably you wouldn't go down that route. So the microsite place to host your content. Then I would suggest what you need to think about is creating hero assets that you would drop, maybe on a monthly basis. And the hero assets would be things like, the thought leadership booklet, the ebook, the manifesto, if you like. What are we going to do as a business for the European banking sector, and why does does it matter? So what's our point of view? What's our perspective? How can we help? Once you've created, the ebook, then you might have thought leadership white papers. You might be bringing people into webinars or roundtables to talk about some of these issues as a call to action. And ultimately, you're probably going to get into a place where you're going to be supporting the sales team with social selling assets, helping them, engage with prospects and customers online and start to create that they weren't having before. So, in terms of how does this thing manifest itself? It starts with the insight, it moves into strategy, it comes into the value proposition and messaging, and then we find the most compelling ways to land that we can, over an extended period, and we personalize it by account. And in some cases, we might even say we're going to personalize it by role or persona, because we know that the CTO has a different agenda to the CFO or the COO, etc. But the persona-based sort of versions are probably things that come downstream, when you're 3 months in, 6 months in, etc.
Yep. So that's a really interesting mix, because I was just like sitting there counting up the things that I want to question you about, right? And so just for those people that are listening today, you mentioned a microsite and you mentioned the landing page, and I've covered this before, but maybe a fresh version of what that is. What's the difference to you between the two?
Well, good question. I mean, I think people use them interchangeably. And sometimes people talk about a microsite when they really mean a landing page. And sometimes people build a landing page when they really want a microsite because they think it's cheaper, quicker. Mm-hmm. Simplistically, I would say a microsite is probably a more complex beast. Yep. And it might be something that looks almost like a little website, and it's going to have tabs and it's going to have different places you can take people on. Whereas a landing page is probably going to be a simpler piece. It's going to host content. It may scroll all the way down the thing, and it's a single entity. But frankly, you're the techie and I'm not, Paul. So, maybe you should be giving people definitions of the difference between a microsite and a landing page. I think the key thing is, do we have an online presence where we can take people who are responding to this program and personalize their experience? And whatever that's called, frankly, doesn't really matter too much, I don't think.
Okay. And so moving on from there, we started with microsites, and we were talking about like that differentiation. You said like that unique insight. Now, does that mean even with a one to few, right? There's like nuances, but does that mean that insight? Are we looking at like at the thing that knits the industry together? So, for example, right now, let's say I was going after the banks. Would I be saying to myself, right, I want to land these 20 accounts, and they're probably all worrying about how does ChatGPT affect banking of the future? And do I go and do that research? And is that the thing that I could focus on? Like, I'm trying to get some context to that. Can you elaborate around that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the key thing is the whole point of doing the research is to the shoes of the customer. Mm-hmm. So many companies talk about doing ABM, and then all they really want to do is to push their products at people. And that is ABM, that's marketing to accounts. Mm-hmm. If you're going to do account-based marketing, then essentially you have to understand what are the issues that are keeping them awake at night. Obviously, it has to be relevant to your business. Yep. You're not talking about electric vehicles if you're in the software industry, or you're probably not. But you're looking for the big themes, and the big themes will be things you can tap into. Some of them directly because you have a solution that will help, resolve a problem. But some of them just to show that actually you understand their industry. So in the past it could have been GDPR. ESG is obviously a hot topic for everybody. CSR or whatever you want to call that piece. Digital transformation has been a major theme for years. Right now, we've clearly got an impending, and if you believe the media, we've got a lot of issues going on from a geopolitical point of view, without naming names, the obvious springs to mind. So there are big themes, but then there could be other things that are going on that are regulatory. They could be regional if we're looking at Europe and the EU, or of course the UK post. And then there might be sort of more directly, pertinent technology issues or HR issues or whatever else is going on. So it's about having a rounded view of the industry so that you can empower your salespeople to go and have conversations that are not just about, hello, can I talk to you about my products that I'd like to sell you, but let's have a grown-up conversation about the industry and about how that's affecting you. And then, of course, when you get into the marketing, it's about creating the context to look like you're an authority on the topic. And if you think about, the whole driver for ABM, it's about building your reputation as a company. It's about building relationships and conversations. And of course, ultimately, it's about getting you to some kind of revenue opportunity. But the revenue opportunity doesn't just land in your lap. You have to earn the respect of the people you're talking to, and you have to prove the credit of your organization. And that's where understanding their business, I think, comes in.
So, I mean, this is something that comes up quite a lot, because I feel like many people, if we just take inbound marketing, right, there's agencies on this call, and they probably HubSpot agencies, and so they'll have that whole inbound ethos. ABM isn't inbound at a target account, is it?
No. I mean, it's fair to say that you could do some quality brand building communications inbound and start to qualify people into your program. So I think inbound is a great qualifier. Looking at the profile of the organizations and their level of engagement, that might be that they get fast tracked into a one-to-few program. In the same way that you could look at intent and say, well, these companies are really spiking from an intent perspective. That's a volume play, but how do I bring in the top 20? And what are the criteria I'm going to use to select them? So, I would say inbound has a role to play in ABM, but it's probably at the top of the funnel, and it's probably far more about qualifying accounts that look interesting into your ABM activity, rather than seeing ABM or inbound, if you like, as an end product of ABM. It's the start, really.
Okay, and that's an interesting point, because that just starts to make me think about the kind of content that you might be putting forward. So, again, that mind's eye thing is, if I'm thinking about my target account and I'm either, one-to-one, one-to-few, so, there's not many, 10, 12, 15, whatever that looks like. Am I really looking at my per decision maker, per committee member? And am I diving right into them and saying what's important to them? And sometimes am I going to produce content that they just need rather than what I might have planned for? Does that ever happen with ABM?
I don't know. I mean, for me, if you're looking at a particular sector and a particular number of accounts, you're proactively going to talk to them about things that you've identified are important to them. So, there might be general stuff that you're putting out there as a brand that starts to bring people into a conversation, which I would call inbound. I think if you're looking at 15 to 20 accounts, it's your job, running the ABM program, to understand that sector and to have a point of view on those accounts and to know the people you should be talking to. So, for example, if we're doing one-to-few, I don't think you're really going after personas. You're going after real people. So, you might start by saying, well, what are the top 10, 15, 20 job titles of the people I need to reach based around the profile of what I'm selling? But then you're not doing persona marketing. You actually go and find those 15 to 20 people. And where possible, you identify what they're saying, and what's important. And, if you got into a major deal cycle, then you might even want to do profiling of the top 5, top 10 people to find out what they're saying, what they think. You might want to look at, doing psychographic profiling of them if the deal's big enough, and so on. So for me, one-to-few is definitely about taking a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach, which I think I would tend to describe more as inbound marketing.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That's a really good definition there. And so also you talked about the role of sales, right? Because marketing owns ABM. So why is Robert talking about sales?
Well, marketing owns ABM only because, ABM, because it's in the acronym, right? I mean, a lot of companies have renamed ABM to account-based engagement, account-based experience, account-based growth. And one of the reasons they've done that is because it's something that's owned by marketing. The marketing department or the marketing leadership team might be the orchestrators of ABM, but there's no way they can own the end-to-end piece. I think it's absolutely critical, particularly at one-to-one and one-to-few levels, that you have the sales team completely bought in from the outset. The accounts, helping you define where we are and where we want to be, discussing where are the gaps in their knowledge, helping you create your strategy for engaging those accounts, and probably even contributing to the value proposition and messaging. And of course, marketing can go off and create some great content and some great assets and land those, but then what? Well, you need the sales team to be ready, literally ready, to be able to pick up the phone, to follow up on social media, to start engaging the customers in a conversation. So from that perspective, you can't do one-to-few ABM, in my opinion, without having the sales team intrinsically involved in the program.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because when we were working together with that client, when we brought the intent piece into play, so we're like, there's your target accounts, but here's who's in play, right? And they kind of match the same ICP, and all of a sudden it was like, well, we need a target account list for sales. We were like, well, you're not operating like independently of each other, right? Because the idea is, this is your ABM approach, or your ABG, ABE, ABS, whatever you want to call it. This is the approach, and this is what we're trying to get people in, so we can understand how we bring this account to bear. But just because you're doing this from an outreach perspective, because these companies are actively looking for said product or service, what we're able to do then is say, yeah, sure, go and call them. And if you kind of activate someone, then remember, you've got to enroll that account into ABM, right? That's the way that you do that. How would you kind of explain that deeper?
Well, I think in some ways you're edging into one-to-many territory for me, because I think if you're looking at one-to-few, then you've pre-selected those accounts based around using some intelligent criteria. And that intelligent criteria could be, what's the size of the organization? What are their revenues? What's their employee base look like? Where, how many operations do they have? It could be using intent to qualify whether they're in market. And it could, of course, be looking at engagement based around previous content, which could have been inbounds. A number of different sources that you want to use to select your 20 accounts. But once you've selected those 20 accounts, whilst some might come in and some might leave, it is a fairly stable group that you want to now go and land. We've picked European banks. They don't stop being European banks overnight. And if there's a very large revenue opportunity there that you're going to invest 6 to 12 months in, then the focus doesn't really change much. You might upgrade an account into one-to-one. You might downgrade an account where you've realized the competition have just won a major deal and you're not going to win anything from them for 5 years. But I don't think you're constantly kind of trawling data once you've got that core set. The reason I mention one-to-many is because I think that's where you are trawling the core data. You're looking at the total addressable market, or the whatever we want to call it, TAM, TOM, ROM, whatever acronym you want to think of. But you are constantly trawling that to look for intent. You're constantly looking at organizations that are engaging with you, and you might bring 1 or 2 of those into your one-to-few program if they fit the profile. Maybe there's a challenger bank that you haven't selected in your top 20 that come in because of those reasons. But I think for me, it's just the one-to-few program is a strategic play into a core set of accounts over an extended period. And that's not to say that that's the only thing you're doing. You still want your one-to-many, play. You still want intent. You still want to be thinking about engagement. You might have some major deals at the top end with one-to-one. So as you know from our training conversations, I'm a big fan of blended ABM. But I think this centerpiece of a one-to-few program, once you've selected those accounts, you're really focused on them for a reasonable period of time to try and do a meaningful job.
So this leads me into a really good question, right? Because it kind of played into my advantage here, that if you're listening to us talk, right, and you're dropping bombs. I mean, there's great information you're sharing here. One of the things that kind of that stood out to me there is, if you're maybe a head of marketing or a head of sales on this call, right, and you're thinking about ABM and you're going to convince your leadership team to do this thing, there are going to be times where, you know, it's going to be like squeaky bum time, and do we stay the course or do we jump ship and go back to something like demand gen? What's your experience for companies that kind of run into that? Oh my God, we've been doing it for like 5 months and nothing's happening. Like, what have you seen, and how have you kind of helped people navigate that?
Well, I think clearly everybody has high expectations of ABM. You know, everybody's read about it, everybody's excited about it. There's so many people talking about it that it is dangerous that if you go into this, you know, thinking that it's going to be a silver bullet where we start ABM and in a few weeks' time, you know, everything's coming up roses. You definitely need to set the expectations for the business, which is, what is ABM? How does it work? What's the difference between one-to-one, one-to-few, one-to-many? You know, are we looking for leads here, for example? No, we're not looking for leads at all. You know, this is a strategic play into 10, 20 accounts, as we've said, with one-to-few. And if we know we're targeting the banking sector and we think there's some real opportunities there, then it's our job to go and engage that sector in a meaningful way. As I said to you earlier, you know, they don't stop being major banks 3 months into the program because they haven't bought anything from you.
Mm-hmm.
You could say, well, you know what, we've been wrong, and actually the major banks are not actually a candidate for us, and therefore you might have to, you know, change your strategy and say, we're going to drop down a tier and we're going to look at challenger banks or asset management companies or whatever it might be. Or you might even say that there are other sectors outside of financial services that we think about. But I think, you know, if you're in a position where you've sold ABM in as a strategic initiative, aligning sales and marketing, you've picked the right verticals, you've picked the right accounts by, you know, doing due diligence, research, insight, and you've got a really strong story, then I think you just have to, you know, stick to your guns and make it work.
Yeah.
You know, I won't say failure is not an option, but it isn't, frankly, if those companies are that important to you. The thing I think that I would suggest with ABM, which is why I'm always saying take a blended approach, is there is a danger of people say, well, we'll do an ABM pilot, you know, and whether you pick 2 one-to-one accounts or you pick a sector in one-to-few, if you just do that, there isn't a guarantee of success, you know. But if you said, actually, we're going to take a blended approach, so we're going to have a one-to-many play where we're going to be looking at accounts, using intent, using digital marketing, using social, and we're going to be trying to warm them up and bring them down the funnel, you know, that in a way that would be useful to us, then that will generate leads and conversations that will keep the sales team fed, and will give you some metrics, if you like, to show traction. But then coming back to the one-to-few, it's like, this isn't something that we muck around with. You know, this is a strategic play for us. Now let's make it work. You know, and the same would be true of one-to-one, even though, again, you might go 3 months, 6 months down the line with an account and then take a view that it's not flying, so we're going to move on to another one. And the reason I sort of said earlier on that I like one-to-few is it gives you some flexibility, because if you've got 10, 15, 20 accounts, you know, if 1 or 2 of them don't come through for you, or even half of them don't come through, you've still got other candidate accounts to be working with.
And so does that, in your mind, mean that with one-to-few and one-to-one, you mentioned 7 figures for one-to-one, so where would you bottom out in figure length for one-to-few?
Well, good question. I mean, again, I think they are genuinely big opportunities. It's obviously difficult not knowing, you know, people's businesses and sizes and so on, but normally I would say, just as a ballpark, you'd be talking about $1 million plus for a one-to-one program. You'd probably be talking about $500,000 plus for a one-to-few, maybe 250 plus. Okay. You know, if your average annual contract value or your average order value is modest, then you're going to really want to think quite hard about whether you're going to be doing one-to-one or one-to-few. It's not to say you can't take some of the things that come from a one-to-few program and say we're going to turn the heat up on this particular group of accounts because, and do that in a more modest way. But I think you need to be very careful. You know, I mean, there's a lot of stuff floating around at the moment saying ABM is not for everyone, and it isn't for everyone. You know, I think you do need to be looking at an enterprise play in most cases, and you need to be looking at a relatively high ticket value for what it is you're selling, even if that's laddered up to lifetime value rather than, you know, average order value.
Yeah. So in your experience, PLG companies that kind of say they have an enterprise offering, which is really culmination of a number of users typically, as opposed to a genuine enterprise offering. In those circumstances, like, do you advise ABM or not? And I know you probably need a case by case basis, but my sense of this is, and working with these PLG companies, is enterprise is critical mass of users. Whereas if you've got a genuine enterprise offering, it's typically you have an offering that an enterprise, a $1 billion company, can buy and use, and it will be in excess of 3s and 4s and 5 hundreds of thousands per year to your company. So how would you differentiate that?
Well, it's a tough question, Paul. You know, I mean, I think I would say, just for the record, you know, I've worked with startups where I've recommended ABM to them, and one-to-one ABM. And I'm thinking particularly of a company that were in the kind of e-commerce space and the retail space, and winning a company like Unilever, you know, or a Procter & Gamble would completely have transformed their business. So we treated those companies as a one-to-one program and went off and did ABM to them. Now, obviously, they don't have, you know, as a startup, they didn't have hundreds of thousands of pounds to invest in this program, but you one of the key approaches, which is, how do we understand this account? How do we find the right people? How do we create a story that's going to be relevant and engaging for them? How can we land compelling communications? You know, so I think I would almost say you have to sort of approach ABM on a company by company basis. It's almost relevant for your business as much as it's relevant for your customers. And you have to think about, well, what are we trying to do here? Are we raising brand awareness and trying to create early stage engagement with a large number of companies, one to many? You know, are we trying to cherry pick some really large opportunities in perhaps a key vertical where we know we have strengths, where we have customer case studies and stories? You know, that would be one to few, clearly. And do we have some massive whale opportunities, either from companies that we've won, but we know there's massive untapped opportunity, or that we really want to break into, like the Unilever example I mentioned? Yeah. And that justifies a one-to-one approach. So it is really, I think, you know, I've said to you, I think before, it's about having the building blocks of ABM and then knowing what to do with them. You know, there isn't a one size fits all. No. And, you know, even the way you describe one to few to the way I describe it, to the way somebody else describes it, may be slightly different. But I think the key thing is that people don't try and take shortcuts, you know, by saying, oh, well, we can do one to few because we know a lot about this sector. We won't do any research. We won't do any insight. We'll make it all persona based. And then the wheels will come off.
Cool. Right, guys, for you guys that are listening, Rob has got like a 7-minute window, right? That's why his eyes are watching the clock. So if you've got any questions, please drop them in the chat and we'll start to ask them. But if I don't get any questions, he is going to jump in about 6 or 7 minutes. So please do take that time to ask questions if you've got any. But what I will say, Rob, some of what you've been talking about sounds like, as much as if we call it account-based marketing, account-based sales, whatever it is, it sounds like there's an element of sales enablement that's needed. Even when you sort of said, look, I talked to a startup and I said, you can go and do ABM. There was a sense of, you know, building decks, all those things that you do, that's about enabling the business to buy from you. Do you see sales enablement playing a part in account-based marketing?
Absolutely. I mean, I think true account-based marketing involves anybody touch the account, you know, so it's marketing for sure, but it's sales, clearly. I think it involves customer success. It involves biz dev, you know, if teams have those kind of people. And everything you're trying to do with account-based marketing is sales enablement by definition. We're trying to enable the sales team to win business. We're trying to enable the company to win business. So, I think a lot of these terms are kind of artificial in a way. Some of them self-serving because genius consultants or genius agencies have decided, well, we're going to go down the sales enablement route. But really, it's a holistic view, which is if you're in business, sell to a certain type of company, how do you do that most effectively? That, for me, is account-based marketing. Whether you use that acronym or not, you need to be able to pull in all of the influences, if you like, that you have control over to make sure that you're optimized for success.
Cool. I think we just landed a question from Alvaro, and he says, what type of paid communication do you do when there is not enough audience to target?
Well, that does sound like a media question. I defer to you on that one, Paul. I mean, for me, account-based marketing isn't really about a media buy. There will be times when you want to do LinkedIn advertising because you want to reach a large number of accounts, so you don't necessarily know who all the right people are within those. But I would far rather talk about ABM in the context of finding the right individuals within accounts that you want to land your communications with, reaching out to them potentially on an individual basis via social media, getting your sales team to connect with them, start having conversations and so on. So maybe I should let you answer the scale question from a media perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of read that and a couple more questions spring to mind. I'm thinking, first thing that springs to mind is when you say there's not enough audience to target, does that mean like you've got like a really hyper small vertical or a really small number of accounts to target, or you're not fully aware of the invisible buyers within this decision for the product that you're selling? If there's some context you could give us, that would be great. But if not, I would only be thinking about like media in one-to-many, because that's where you run high volume of air cover at a high number of accounts, broad base, 800,000-900,000 accounts using intent data, which we've talked about a little bit earlier in the conversation. And if you're trying to just target the active market plus some key accounts, air cover makes like supreme sense, right? Because it's a mass game. But I think what Robert's really nailed down here is that whether you do one-to-one or one-to-few in the truest sense of what account-based, sales and marketing is, it's hyper personalized, targeted communications to the people within the businesses that you're trying to engage and open and ultimately land. So there's a very different approach there, and hopefully that kind of gives you something to think about without us getting more context here. Are there any more questions? Cool. Oh, here we go. Deal. Thank you. Right. Thanks for the talk, guys. Do you think that ABM is recommended when the company is still trying to figure out the ICP and product market fit? Robert, that one could be for you.
No, I wouldn't recommend. I think if you don't know who you're selling to and you don't know what your product does for them, then ABM would be a fool's errand, really. I think you need to have a very clear idea of who you're selling to. You need to understand their needs and business drivers, as I mentioned earlier. And you certainly need to know where you fit, not just in the context of what you can do, but also in the context of the competition and what they can do. So I wouldn't do ABM, lightly, and I wouldn't recommend you do it if you don't know where you're going. Any road will take you there, and ABM probably isn't that road.
Yeah, I think, Gil, for me personally, I wouldn't even be thinking about doing anything other than figuring out where my product is in the market. I'd be looking for early design partners. I don't know if you've got a product market within the organization, but you would definitely need someone like that can do like that competitive discovery piece, the analysis, understanding where you guys actually fit in the market, and then working out what buyers actually think you are. Now, for me, there's a couple of websites. Winter's very expensive, but you could go down the Winter route. And then on the lower cost end of the market, maybe respondent.io. Book some interviews with the people that you think would be buying this product and go and speak to them and understand what they think it is. But hopefully that gives you some insight on what you could do and take away from this. Robert, I know that you're coming to an abrupt end, and he has to go. But guys, look, Robert, can you just let the people know where they can get in touch with you, and maybe where they can even find you for some training?
Sure. Well, you can certainly reach out to me on LinkedIn anytime you want. You can also find me delivering the ABM Essentials course through B2B Marketing, and you can contact me through b2bmarketing.net, where I have an email address and obviously part of that team as well. So those are probably the two easiest ways to find me. And sorry to be leaving after 40 minutes, Paul, but we did pre-agree this, so I hope nobody. I'm doing the dirty on you.
No worries. Look, Robert, thanks for joining. If there's any more questions, I'm happy to stay around. If not, Robert does have to shoot. Rob, I appreciate you being here, and I'll catch up with you offline. To the audience, thanks for hanging around. I am here for another 10 minutes if you need me. You know, I'm happy to answer any questions. If not, feel free to keep following us. The AMA is following up on Thursday. If you've got no questions today, feel free to come back on Thursday at 1 p.m. GMT, where I'll be happy to field any questions you have. But hopefully this was a really good session. I was dying for Robert to come in and talk to you guys. So thanks for being here. Contact me, Paul, at biasdigital.com if you have any questions. Visit the website. There's a wealth of information about early stage SaaS and tech. But yeah, appreciate you being here, and I will catch up with you all soon. Thanks a lot, guys. Cheers.